Cool. Well, let's jump in. Patty Krawec, thank you so much for joining me on this afternoon. It's kind of cloudy where both of us are. And as you are my witness, I've been gently following you around the interwebs for some time. And so I'm super excited that we're here for this conversation. Thanks for joining me.
Well, thank you so much for inviting me. I love having these conversations.
Cool. Well, let's jump in. As you know, I first found you through your podcast. So I was actually thinking it'd be great if you could just tell us a little bit about sort of who you are and what you do. And then I'd love to hear how you came to be doing all that you're doing. So in your own words, what are you up to?
What am I? So I have a background in social work. I mean, I'm a wife, I'm a mom, I'm a grandma. I do have a background in social work. I spent 16 years in child welfare, which is a whole other story that we could talk about. It was through that work that I met Carrie, and I was at a conference, and they had invited us, or challenged us, I should say, to talk with our clients about race. Talk with our clients about, and this was an academic conference, so it was a really wide range. It wasn't specific to social work. And they just said, talk to the people you work with, your students, your clients, your colleagues, talk to them about race, ask them about their experience of you and of the organization and all of these things. And so I started with Carrie because she was very open and friendly, and I felt like I could practice with her. So I did. And all of our conversations then kind of slid sideways into race. And so as I did this with my clients, I realized that they wanted to talk to me about race. They wanted to talk to me about how they moved through, the cities that we lived in, as Black people, as Indigenous people. The kids had things that they wanted, like not just Carrie's kids, but like just, in general with the clients. The kids had things they wanted to tell me about their experiences at school, about their experiences in the neighborhood. And it was really important. And nobody had asked them these questions before, because we're not taught to talk about race. We're not, and really as an Indigenous woman, it's not a secret that I'm Indigenous. And so it's not a secret that I'm Ojibwe. And so for somebody to ask me, what's it like being a Native woman in church? I can talk to you about that because it's not a secret. It's very plain. Anybody can see me. It's obvious. And so with Carrie, all of our conversations, kind of went this way, and we were talking about how she was going to protect her grandchildren, who she was caring for, in this, very white community that she was raising them in. And she says, well, I can't protect them. They're going to go to school. They're going to be in the playground. They're going to be in the mall. They're going to be places. I can't protect them. And then, of course, being a social worker, I went to social work language, and I said, okay, so how do you build resilience in them? Because that's how we survive traumatic events, right? Is we build resilience in ourselves, and that helps us to survive difficult or traumatic events. And she smiled, and I always tell the story, because she smiled. She literally did. She smiled and she leaned back, and she started talking about how she tells them who they are, and how she, about their history, and about, family members, and, kind of the collective history of, the Afro-Caribbean community in Canada, and then the broader Afro and, Afro community and diaspora. And then we just thought that, like, we just cracked each other up all the time. Like, these were not like terrible, intense conversations. These conversations were full of laughter, and kind of reciprocal, they're very reciprocal conversations. And so we thought we were hilarious, and that the rest of the world needed to listen to our conversations. And then that's how the podcast happened. And then the podcast was initially just the two of us talking about life, but there's just far too many interesting people out there that are building communities and building life in so many interesting ways. And so I started sending out messages to people, mostly on Twitter, because I actually changed my official bio to say that I live on Twitter. Saying, hey, I have a podcast. Do you want to talk to me? And people would say yes.
Yeah.
People would say, sure, I'd love to talk to you. And so that's how we just, and we have like incredible people that spoke with us, just shared their knowledge with us. And I often joke that people who listen to the podcast, hear me learning in real time, because some of our guests will push back on us You know, we'll push back on something that I'm saying because we don't know everything, right? We know our experience, we know our community experience, but a lot of these Black and Indigenous conversations aren't happening, and they are fraught. They're fraught with Indigenous erasure. They're fraught with anti-Black racism in Indigenous communities, you know, so they can be difficult, complicated conversations. But I have really valued Carrie's generosity and you know, and these conversations and the generosity of our guests, and you know, and we actually have some more conversations planned in the new year. So
Good.
I'm pretty excited. We took a year off. I mean, publishing a book is a lot more work than I thought it would be.
Yeah.
Really underestimated the amount of work involved. I don't know how people with full-time jobs do it. I really have no idea because I'm retired now. But yeah, so that's how the podcast happened. And the book, Becoming Kin, really would not have happened without those 5 years, because there's just so much I learned about our communities and about how to exist in the world that it really would not have happened without that podcast, which would not have happened if I had not taken that leap and started talking to my clients about race, and talking to them about race and asking them, how do you experience child welfare? How do you experience school? How do you experience your neighborhood? And then listening to them, listening to that answer and not getting defensive, because often it was about the agency I worked for being a racist place, you know, being, you know, and the policies that we had that play out unequally, you know, along racial lines, you know, and so I had to be able to listen to that without getting defensive, you know, be able to listen to it and then take that back and think about how policies that seem neutral were actually not neutral. And can we make change? Can we do something? And just realizing how little systems actually do want to change. And then I retired.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh boy. Lots of places we could go there. I want to just stay grounded a little bit in the podcast for a moment, and then I'd love to go deeper into the book and where some of the really, I think, important and valuable signals are that you've offered to the world. And for people who are brand new to you and this conversation, I'll make sure that it's really easy to find the Medicine for the Resistance podcast and access to you and Carrie's work and thinking. And I'll just frame this from my own perspective, which was that I really came upon the first episode that I heard by happenstance. I actually can't remember what prompted me to find you. So, you know, the interwebs and the universe kind of colluded to give me the episode that was you interviewing, I believe her name is Marina Nabau, the Brazilian woman.
Oh, yes. Yeah.
Whom I guess Carrie has done some work with. And the serendipity, I'm actually getting goosebumps remembering this because, as you know, I've collaborated and done some work in Brazil and have some very deep and important relationships there professionally and personally. So my ears kind of perked up like, oh, there's a Brazilian guest. That's kind of neat. Let's see what she has to say. But before you got into the episode, and I should have double checked before, but I believe I was listening to this something like May 2019. So the world hadn't gone totally kerflooey just yet. Well, it was already kerflooey in various ways, but not officially comprehensively kerflooey. I had recently relocated from New York to Montreal, was kind of noticing some very, what I would call radical erasure here in Montreal. And we can dive into specifics around that a bit more, but it is fascinating and disturbing, the amount of erasure of the Mohawk communities and the sort of present day or recent history. So I was kind of becoming aware of that through active conversations here. And then I tune in, I can picture where I was walking as I was listening to this podcast. But before you began live with your guest, you, Patty, had just printed out a copy of the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women report that had just come out. And you were noticing and commenting on how the term genocide was being used, and you were underscoring the importance of that. And I remember thinking, finally, pennies are dropping in this country. Like, finally, we are snapping out of our fog and able to have the kind of dialogue and interpersonal awakenings that are required. And here we are 3 years later, and I feel like there's still a lot more work to be done. We're really just at the beginning. So I wonder if you could, in whatever way makes sense to you, help us understand the arc of your own understanding of how to communicate with the wider world as an Indigenous woman, co-host of a podcast exploring some of these complex issues around race. How did you go from there to writing the book Becoming Kin? And what was your journey to say, I got to write this stuff down and put it out there?
Okay, so I didn't mean to write a book.
And then you wrote the book of the century. Okay.
It was an accident.
Oh.
Yeah, so I've been podcasting for 5 years, well, 4 years, I think at that point, with Carrie having all of the, I often said that, outside of my spouse who I live with, I talk with her more than any human on the planet, like during the years when we were recording almost every week. So we have all of these conversations, and yeah, the genocide word was really important. And they actually put, they put in the legal framework for why they used the term genocide, because of course the Truth and Reconciliation Commission stopped short. They called it a cultural genocide because of course cultural genocide is not a legal term. It's meaningless. It's like ethical water at Starbucks. It doesn't mean anything.
That's a great example.
It's just marketing.
We'll come back to that very point in just a few minutes. Yep.
Well, because actually a cultural genocide was actually included in the original definition when it was put out, I think in 1947. It was included in the original definition, and Canada said, basically take that out or we won't sign on.
Since we're guilty as charged.
We won't agree if you don't take this out. So the UN took it out, Canada agreed to this definition. But it still meets the criteria, right? Like everything that has happened still meets the criteria of genocide. And in my book, I put in the definition of genocide, and I show how, how all of these different things that Canada and the US have done meet the criteria of genocide. So what happened was with, as far as the book goes, so the conversation with the podcast, I start noticing things, I'm paying attention to things, I'm hearing from people all over the continent. One of the things I really like to do is make connections between things. So when Marina is talking about, and that was a fascinating conversation with me because I had no idea how Blackness worked. Blackness and indigeneity. I had no idea how those things work outside of a North American context. And they do work differently in different places, according to what whiteness needs, right? So that's always according to what whiteness needs. And so I was fascinated to hear from her how it works in Brazil. And, and the genocide that took place there, the ongoing genocides really, because so many of these things are still happening. They kind of get different names now, but we're still trafficking children from Indigenous families to white families. We're still disregarding, the mass death of Indigenous people. Ruth Wilson Gilmore has a definition of racism that I find so helpful, where she talks about group differentiated vulnerabilities to premature death. Because we think about racism as being rude. Like really, that's Canadians consider racism rude. Like it's
not nice.
It's basically discrimination. You shouldn't discriminate against people for any reason. That's how Canadians think about racism. But what I really find helpful about Ruth Wilson Gilmore's definition is it forces us to look at the outcomes. Who is dying disproportionately? And so when we look at who is dying disproportionately, that leads us to very specific racial categories. And so we talk about genocide. And what happened with the book, so I'm sitting in church one Sunday and the preacher starts talking about identity politics. And if you're not going to rely on the Combahee River Collective's definition of identity politics, because they're the ones that emerged the term, then just stop talking, because you don't know what you're talking about. So he was talking about, at that time, Billie Jean King had just come out against trans athletes, saying that they shouldn't be competing in their gender. And his point was, if an icon like Billie Jean King can, get taken down by the mob, because she got a lot of blowback for that, a lot of,
Right.
a lot of very deserved criticism for that, then identity politics is out of control. And the sermon went on to be how we're all the same in Jesus and all of that nonsense. And I sat there feeling very erased. Like, but I exist as an Indigenous woman, no matter what room I walk into. I don't stop being, hearkening back to that challenge that I had been given at that conference to talk to my clients about race. What if churches talk to their congregants about race, about two-spiritedness, about, about queerness, about how do you exist within the church but they don't, they erase it. We're all the same in Jesus. So I should say some churches are starting to have those conversations, but for the most part, particularly in evangelical circles, no. So I was furious. And so I was posting about it on Facebook and Twitter all afternoon, and that really didn't make me feel any better. So, excuse me. So I wrote an article that got published in Sojourners magazine about how the church, in finding home, made Indigenous peoples homeless, and erasing our identity. And how do we exist differently in relationship? Can Indigenous people live in relationship with the church without being erased? How do we do that? And an editor contacted me on Twitter and asked if I had ever thought of writing a book. And I sent it to a couple of friends of mine and said, who are published authors. And I said, like, is this real? Like, am I going to be out $5,000?
Yeah, that's right.
And then have a box of books that nobody wants? Like, I don't understand. What is this? Because I know this doesn't happen. I know that this is very, very unusual. And she had seen my Twitter feed. So she knew who she was asking. And both of my friends said, no, you need to jump on this. This is real. So I responded to her and I said, well, I am now. Up until this moment, I really
now that you mention it, yeah,
but I am now, and so it wasn't a short thing. We still had to go through the proposal process and the sample chapter and all of that. And I'll tell you, writing a sample chapter is a lot different than writing Twitter threads.
Yes,
it's a lot different. So she's wonderful. I had a really good relationship with her. She's a white woman editing, a Native woman. So we talked about that. But what she also did was invited me to use that strong language in the book, where I had just described these horrors and called it a period of upheaval and disruption. And she said, that really doesn't do justice to what you've just described. And so I said, okay, let's call it genocide and ethnic cleansing. And we left that in there. And so that's where that, and so for all of my outspokenness, I'm still, in some ways, we still moderate ourselves.
Yes.
For fear we don't want to alienate the audience, right? Or we don't want to alienate the people that are signing our paychecks or any of those things. And so we moderate ourselves. And what Valerie did was kind of freed me from that and said, no, like, you need to use the stronger language. That's what's appropriate for this. So I really appreciated that. And so I didn't mean to write a book. I was just podcasting and, writing articles here and there, and basically got found in a malt shop. And the idea, what she had talked about was, because I think we can all see that the world is changing very rapidly in ways, some ways are profoundly hopeful, and other ways not so much. Right? I mean, everything that they did to get this, they're going to do to keep it. And they will use all the violence at their disposal in order to keep what they've stolen already. But there has to be another way forward. There has to be. Worlds begin and end all the time, and we go forward. But what are we going to go forward into? What kind of world are we going to build? Right? Because we always hear about burn it down, but we are in the business of world building every day. And so what she had said to me was about Indigenous ways of kinship, how Indigenous ways of kinship could save us. And this was kind of the book she was looking for as an acquisitions editor. And I told her, I said, it's not our responsibility to save you. But I like this idea of kinship.
Yeah.
I like this idea of kinship and relationship, and how can we, without Indigenous people needing to transform ourselves into good empire citizens or good Christian citizens, and without settlers and newcomers needing to transform themselves into Indigenous peoples, because both of those things are unhelpful.
Yeah.
How can we collectively reach back into our histories and pull forward things that help us build a better world? How can we do that? And so that was the impetus behind the book, which of course meant that we had to go back through the history first. First, we had to connect all of those dots and see how all of these things are connected, so that we could then move forward into what kind of world do we want? What are we bringing forward, and what are we building now that we've acknowledged all of these terrible things and seen how connected they are?
Oh, I love it. And as an aspiring writer, I particularly love that you weren't even meaning to write a book. And here, I'm holding in my hands what I say without exaggeration, I think is the most important book to come out in this country this century. And I think it has really international relevance. And I want to touch on that in a moment, but I wanted to pick up on something that you mentioned that I really want to underscore for folks thinking about what they're reading and where they're pointed to in terms of understanding, let's say, Indigenous ways of knowing. And I'm drawing on, so I'm a white settler, and I always will be. And I get involved in a lot of conversations about different cultural circumstances just by dint of my work and my kind of endless curiosity. I'm very blessed to have some friends who are First Nations here in Canada and parts of Indigenous or other traditional communities outside of where I live here. And so I often, I guess, among my peer group, I get a lot of messages from folks, oh, you'll like this book, or this will be interesting. And I thought of you when I heard about the speaker, something to do with an Indigenous topic, let's say. Which I'm, happy about, but also sort of think, well, it's not really a topic, right? Like there's more, this isn't a thing on a list, but I understand where people are coming from. So the one that comes up a lot in terms of books is Robin Wall Kimmerer's Braiding Sweetgrass, which I'm sure you're more than familiar with. And I've read it, and I remember reading it a few years ago and thinking, yeah, this is lovely. Like these are beautiful stories, and it's, recommend, like nothing's in the way there. It's a wonderful compendium of, I guess you call them short stories, nonfiction, and really seeking to combine, I think the way she positions it is something like Indigenous and Western scientific ways of knowing. It's like, that's really interesting. And lots of people I know reference that book when this wider topic of Indigenous ways of knowing comes up. And when I read your book, a couple things happened. On that language point, I feel like I really agree that you left strong language in there. I mean, there's some language where it's like, wow, there's no way around the pain of that phrase. And you did it with honor and respect. Like I felt respected as a reader, even as a white settler reader. I did not feel threatened or hated or kind of pushed away. I felt invited into the real conversation. And that's scary and unknown. It's difficult. I don't have all the pieces of that puzzle, but it was compelling. And I felt very honored by that. And so I think of when people mention Braiding Sweetgrass, I'm kind of like, think of that as your warm up, a sort of like,
the gateway.
Yeah, where Disney films might give you an idea of what a film is, but then you go to watch like real cinema, and you learn about what, actually goes on in life. So I feel like you are offering that kind of next level. Are you really interested in this conversation? Can you open your hearts and mind to a bigger truth that is challenging and critical? And I really appreciate how you describe, there has to be another way forward, because burning it down, then what? So I'm very grateful for that. I want to just hear your thoughts, if you've got any, on, because I noticed a really neat international or very wide lens in your book. So in some ways, yes, you're talking, you're Canada in quotes, Canadian-based Indigenous woman, but you're talking about the world, and you're talking about world history in many ways. So I'm wondering if you have a point of view on the role of this country in the wider reconciliation journey, for lack of a better word, in the wider path forward that we're striving for. Or is there any uniquely Canadian opportunity here? Or, yeah, I don't want to lead the witness too much.
Well, I mean, Canada has this, I mean, and yes, in a global vision. And again, I'm gonna trace that back to the podcast. Had a lot to do with the people that we talked with. We had Troy Storfield on a couple of times. He's a Sami academic.
Mm-hmm.
And actually, I found out one day that the Caribou, I'm Caribou clan.
Okay. Yep.
My father, and I found out one day that reindeer and caribou are actually the same animal. I had no idea. I didn't know this, and so I told Troy that we were cousins.
Yeah,
we're
cool.
cousins because you're reindeer herders and I'm Caribou clan, so we're cousins.
I love it.
But anyway, so hearing from him about what happened, with the Sami people, understanding that Black people are also Indigenous in their own right.
Yeah.
Like, never mind, like, not just as because of course we didn't just intermarry with Europeans, we also intermarried with we have a long history of relationships with displaced African people as well, and then they have, we had children, but also they were Indigenous people that were uprooted from Africa and brought here. So they too have Indigenous roots, and so Indigenous, not everybody thinks of themselves, may think of themselves that way or have that relationship with a colonial power, but we do have to think globally in terms of colonization. Colonization fanned out across the globe. Mm-hmm. And so those patterns are in play in different ways, depending on, one of the things Australia did not make treaties with any of the Aboriginal, with any of the Indigenous people they found there, because they learned from Canada and the US that that's a big fat mistake, because you legitimize us when you make treaty with us, because you don't make treaties international agreement. You don't make international agreements with people who aren't nations. And so treaty legitimizes us as people, unique people with rights. Whether Canada or the US acknowledges those rights is a completely different matter, but just the fact of engaging us in treaty legitimates us as people. So Australia did not make that mistake. And they just kind of did what Canada does in BC, which is they were no longer making treaties by that point. They were just taking whatever they wanted. And so that's what happened there. In terms of Canada's role on the global stage, Canada really likes to think of itself as the peacemaker and as the good guy, right? Like when Trudeau got up in front of the G20 or whatever, and after his first election, and he told everybody that Canada was back, kind and gentle Canada is back, the terribleness of Harper is gone, and kind and gentle Canada is back. So I think Canada, we could leverage that somehow. Mm-hmm. Canada really likes to see itself in this light. And yet, I don't know, I saw a meme on Twitter that it's really 3 mining companies in a trench coat, because Canada is doing a lot of colonial garbage.
Yeah, exactly.
Through the mining industry, where these corporations are Canadian enough to get diplomatic assistance in order to access Indigenous land, but then not actually Canadian when it comes to dealing with some of the consequences of their behavior. So Canada's got this kind of, but it means taking responsibility. Mm-hmm. And nobody wants to take responsibility. Mm-hmm. Right from the individual who doesn't want to acknowledge, their colonial history, up to the Canadian, up to governments who don't want to acknowledge their role, their role in colonization either. I think was it one of them who had said that there was no colonization in Canada. I don't know, something. It was something ridiculous. And that's that revisionist history. And so that's why, another reason why I went through the first 5 chapters the way I did, because we have to unbury this history.
Mm-hmm.
And the unforgetting is the idea of recovering truth. It's not like, oops, I forgot. It's like, no, this was deliberately covered up.
Yeah.
And a new myth put in its place, which then gets taught in schools and written down in books and kind of promoted as this is the story of Canada. And I mean, it's a really nice story. It's a really nice story. It's just not true.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
And I think, I mean, I don't know. There's a Katya Schott in her book on Repentance and Repair. Daniel Rutenberg quotes historian Katya Schott, who said that she didn't think that the nation states have the capacity for the type of honesty required for repentance and reconciliation. They just don't have the capacity for that kind of honesty. And so that's where I'm, well, okay, then let's build something else. Let's build our communities. Let's build, let's build these transnational relationships. Let's just build them, because they're going to burn themselves down. Like, I don't even need to, really.
Yeah. Yeah.
Like we were watching the implosion of everything with, interest. We talk about was it inflation being at this ridiculous high, and it's like, that's not inflation. Not when Galen Weston is making, raking in ridiculous profits. That's not inflation.
Yeah.
That's profiteering.
Yeah. It's rent seeking and usury.
That's right. That's right.
Yeah.
And when people can't afford a place to live and they can't afford food, you're not giving them any reason to support your authority.
Yeah.
And at some point, something's going to give. So I don't need to worry about that system. The center can't hold. I'm going to worry about what I'm building. What am I building in my drum group? What am I building in my community? What am I building that will survive whatever comes next? So that's my focus. My focus is, and that's where becoming can, because really in the Ojibwe prophecy of the fires, which I talk about in the book, the 7th and 8th fires, these are your decisions. Our responsibility is to get ready and to pick up our bundles and be ready. These are your decisions. And that's, I think, why it's so important. For me, I enjoy having these conversations so much, because I want you to make good decisions. And if we're going to be in relationship, we need to be in a good relationship. And it can't always be Indigenous people giving. Yeah. Right? Because that's not fair. We gave you all that land while you took it, but anyway, you have all that land.
Yeah.
So really, there needs to be some reciprocity, and that's why I like these conversations so much, because they make me feel hopeful. Like people are listening. Like maybe we can imagine business differently. Maybe we can imagine the economy differently. Maybe we can imagine a world where people have housing and food, and where these things are just a given in people's lives, as opposed to something they have to earn.
Yeah. Oh, okay. So let's go there, because one of the things that, I mean, there's too many to list in a conversation like this, but one of the many things I love about your book is that in each chapter you offer a very specific, let's say, action that anybody can take. So you wrap up with how about this? And with each chapter, it was my experience that with each chapter, you kind of take us up a notch and you offer an even more sophisticated challenge. And I wouldn't say challenge in the overwhelming sense. I'd say like you bring us further along with each chapter in very tangible ways that I felt were fantastic. And as I was reading it, because my focus is generally working with companies, with large companies, and with decision makers within companies, as I was experiencing those actions, I was being challenged both as an individual, just going about my day, and as somebody who seeks to bring or shed light on the path forward to industrial decision makers. And I was trying to imagine how I might interpret those actions or calls to action for them. And that, to be honest, that's what led me to reach out to you, because I don't feel qualified to interpret those calls to action. I can sort of make some educated guesses and do my best. But I'd love to hear in your words, What would you ask of industry? And industry is a big term, so you can sort of pick and choose what elements of it you like. There's, of course, mining and finance and real estate and everybody. You talk about relation, about becoming kin, right? What does that mean in the context of the billions of dollars and all the resources that industry is moving around, where we're seeing some ethical water at Starbucks, let's just say. So how would you invite those actions for industry decision makers?
Hmm. Well, I mean, again, and that again, I will give credit to Valerie. That was her idea, because she said, we read these books and we get energized by these books, but we don't know what to do with them.
Yeah,
We don't
white
know what
folks
to
want instructions.
Yeah, give us well, that might even be a direct quote. That might be exactly what she said.
Oh, well, yeah, and it's true. It's
So we want
pathetic.
to know what to do. And I
Yeah.
find that, like after, the unmarked graves started getting
Mm,
more media attention last year. I mean, my inbox gets flooded with, well, what can we do? What can we do? What
mm.
can we do? People want things to do. And so I gave them reading assignments mostly. Was go do
Yeah.
this, go
Go
do
do your
this, go
homework.
read,
Yeah.
go do your homework. Yeah. And so that's kind of where these became homework assignments. And I think for businesses, it really does start with noticing.
Mhm.
Noticing who is at your table, noticing where are the Black and Indigenous people in terms of decision-making capacity? Where are they? Do they have real decision-making capacity, or are they, like, how do you see them? How do you understand them? Do you talk to them? Do your managers know how to talk to the racially marginalized staff members about their experience in this company?
Mhm.
Because and it's about looking at and then looking at policy. I'm very big on policy. Looking at policies.
Mm.
How do how what is the impact of this policy? Can we give it to our diversity committee, which really diversity and inclusion into what? Diversity to
Yeah.
what end? Um,
Yeah.
Diversity to what end? Because we all saw the election in Georgia, right? So we know that simply having Black and Indigenous people around the table doesn't necessarily mean anything. If you have to think very carefully about to what end are you seeking diversity? What are you inviting them into? Because if you're inviting them into, a very extractive colonial way of doing business, then you're going to get people who have resigned themselves to an extractive colonial path forward,
Right.
which is just simply not sustainable. It just isn't. There is no metric out there. We're going to run out of planet. There is no metric out there that demonstrates that an extractive colonial system is going to have any kind of, longevity. So we have to think very clearly, and maybe that would be a good lens, for industry, large and small, to look at those kind of calls to action that I've put in, is to be thinking internally, what are we inviting people into?
Mhm.
What really are our relationships with the world around us? And I often say that I'm like the least mystical native you'll ever meet, and yet I have that beautiful passage on land, where it's alive. It's
Yeah.
alive. And if it's alive, what does that mean for some of our choices
Yeah.
as business leaders, as as people who make decisions? We saw the Dust Bowl. Like, that's where I talk about the land, and I'm talking about the
Yeah.
grapes of wrath, and the Dust Bowl, which was created by unethical or short-term business practices. We're seeing the same drought in California. These things are the result of government and industry decisions.
Yeah.
And so what are our priorities? If you want to know what an organization values, just follow the money. What are you spending your money on?
Yeah. Yeah.
How much is the money just all moving upwards, to people who, and really when we're talking about people with, billions of dollars, that's world changing money. That's
Yeah.
not I'm getting rich and I'm going to live in San Tropez money. That's I'm going to remake the world in my image money. So
Mhm.
what kind of image are you trying to rebuild? Who is being excluded? Who is being included? That's why that first task is to notice.
Yeah.
Where are they? Who are they? who disagrees with you? Why aren't you leaning into that? Why aren't you listening to them? Because they may have some really valuable information for you. Like when I talk to my clients about race and I heard things that were really hard to hear, I had to listen to that. I had asked the question, so they had a right to answer.
Yeah.
But then I had to listen to that, and I had to listen for how was I supporting that? How was I part of what they're talking about? Is there any room? Is there anything that I can do to shift what they're talking about? Because, and that's where I found that quote that I think she's pretty early on in the book by Aurora Levins Morales. If we own these histories, whether we did the thing or not, whether we inherited the corporation, DuPont left all those chemicals in the ground and created Love Canal, but our board wasn't responsible for that because we took over 20 years later and that's not our fault. Well, you inherited it. This is the relationship that you have inherited. So rather than turning our back on it and saying, well, that's not us and it's not our fault, that's not who we are. What if we acknowledged it and then transformed it? Like, isn't that profoundly hopeful? Doesn't that offer all of us who may have, histories, big, corporate histories or whatever that we'd rather not admit, the capacity to transform it? And that's where I'm going to think about abolition now, because our society really doesn't encourage that kind of responsibility. Right? Like I can hear all the lawyers screaming in the background, no, don't take responsibility. Are you out of your mind?
Yep.
Because responsibility means liability, means all these kinds of consequences. And I don't know, maybe those consequences are reasonable. I don't know. But in an abolitionist world, you would be free to take responsibility and then make things right.
Yeah.
Without that kind of punitive reaction that doesn't really serve anyone. And so that's also kind of where my abolitionist bent comes in, is we need a world where people can take responsibility for the things that they have done and the things that they have inherited and make things right, make things the world that we want our kids and our grandkids to grow up in.
It does the heart good to hear that even articulated as a possibility, as a way. It's I love that call. Maybe one last sort of industry thought I'll put to you, and then I'll give you back a piece of your rainy afternoon. One of the things that comes up a lot in corporate sustainability, which is the field I've been kind of mucking around in for a couple of decades, and I've kind of wandered outside the corral, but I still see the corral and I hear the ways. There's a lot of talk about stakeholder engagement, right? So reaching out to different community members, people with different points of view, and listening. And I hear an appetite for better engagement with Indigenous people. I don't fully embrace how it's handled. I do feel like it's often quite checkbox, unless it's regulated, like it might be in some regions around mining or other land use conversations. But even the concept of land use as opposed to land relation, right? Like we have this notion that the term land use is used all the time in business. It's how are we using the land? And so one of the things I've sort of stumbled on this, I guess, just because it made sense to me, because I don't seem to function within the mainstream world very easily. And so I've always wondered, why are we using land as opposed to being with land? And as I've meandered in my own readings and conversations with friends in Indigenous communities in different parts of the world, I've realized like, oh yeah, like that just makes so much more sense. And so what I've been trying to bring into my industrial conversations is this idea that engaging others isn't just humans, it's engaging with the bioregion, with the seasons, with the critters, and not just in a kind of cute way, but in a legitimate way to recognize we really are all interconnected. We are highly interdependent, and frankly, we're quite disposable in the grand hierarchy of living things. And some people kind of get it, but at the senior industrial level, that's a little bit heretical or just weird, right? Like it's just like, what are you're saying we should talk to the river, and I'm thinking, well, of course you should talk to the river. Like, we're on the river, like they're keeping, it's keeping us alive. So I'm curious, you describe yourself as the least mystical Indigenous person around. I think that's probably a stretch, but I'm curious if you were trying to guide, and it's not for you to instruct, so you can just totally reject this question, but how would you frame to industrial folks that being in relation beyond the human world, beyond your community members, or your employees or your investors, what does that look or sound like to you?
Well, I think in one way that it looks, and I'm thinking about a lot of, like you talked about being on the river and being in relationship with the river. We've built a very British way of living in a very non-British geography. Right. So, like I'm thinking about even my own backyard where it's all clay, and, the natural ways that the water flowed have been flattened because people want to build houses. And so now we have all this water everywhere. That before development, and this is, I know, something that urban planners deal with quite a lot, with the amount of concrete and pavement, there's nowhere for the water to go.
Yeah.
And so as, climate changes, however you want to attribute the fact of climate change, climate is changing. And nobody can dispute that. We're going to get, so even how we construct our buildings, how we construct our cities. If we're thinking in terms of being in relationship with the river and paying attention to what's happening with the river, that shifts our architecture, that shifts our urban planning. If we're thinking about being in relationship, with the land itself, that shifts how we do business. We've got seasons. We're constantly building walls around ourselves to live kind of in opposition to whatever is happening, geographically and with the weather. But what if we moved with it? Like these towns that experience like ridiculous flooding on a regular cyclical basis. Like, how come Indigenous people get dragged as, well, they're nomadic? No, we just knew when it was time to not be there.
Yeah. Nice.
we just knew when it was time to not be there and to be someplace else. And so we have really mapped and Chandra Prescott-Weinstein has a really good thing in her book where she talks about Euclidean geometry and, kind of this flat two-dimensional geography that came out of Greece. And, we map it onto a really, onto a nonlinear world, and then wonder why things keep happening to our buildings and to our industries and to people, to our staff, to our workers, because we're trying to fit everybody into this one particular model. And it's not life-giving.
Yeah.
Like, how many people, like, the fact of Mondays is just a joke, but why should we hate Mondays? Why is our life organized around these things that don't give us life? And I'm not talking about like Nerf gun wars, like at Google headquarters and all of that silliness. Play is fun, but if we worked with people and with the natural world around us, we could develop much different models. These things that we think of as being so intuitive, like Euclidean geometry, are not necessarily intuitive. Other cultures and other systems have other ways of doing things and other ways of being in relationship with the world around them. Mm-hmm. We don't have to live this way. This way is not inevitable. And I know that there are companies out there that are trying to do things differently, that are trying to, kind of understand themselves as being in part of a much broader relationship. Mm-hmm. And I think that's really cool. But I don't know. Yeah. I think it's a tough sell in a lot of places because, what's happening right now has gotten a lot of people a lot of money. So why would they fight it?
Yeah. Our incentives are pretty broken. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. But I love what you're describing there, even basics, like how we think about construction. It's all about keeping ourselves siloed from the rest of the world. So there's many places we could go there, but I'm mindful of the time. So I'll bring us to a close here and just invite, if there's anything in particular you would like to leave us with to consider, any invitation, and also how we find you and how we can I'm one of your Patreons. In fact, I did a big tidy up because there was a lot going on. I was like, but this I'm keeping, the Pay Your Rent Patreon, and I'll make sure there's a link in all of the things where this appears. But how else can people find you, and what would you like us to do with the wonderful things you're doing if you were in charge of the universe and giving us
If I was in charge of, wow. Well, people can find me. So my website is daanis.ca. So DAANIS.ca. And basically everything I do is kind of collected in that one little spot. I do have a Substack where I write about books because I love to read. So I do write about kind of, so what does this book say to that book? And what
Nice.
happens? What do I think when I put these two books together?
Love it.
The Pay Your Rent thing, that's a foundation that I run. It started off as kind of a cheeky comment on Facebook or on Twitter, and then it just kind of went out of control. And now it's a foundation. We just had our first AGM. So yeah, Pay Your Rent. We just had our first, we registered as a nonprofit last year. We just had our first AGM a couple of weeks ago. It's payyourrent.ca. So if businesses are doing land acknowledgements and are looking for, somebody to put on their, on their budget line as a way of giving back to Indigenous communities, because for me, the land back is inevitable. If we're going to talk about decolonization or making things right with Indigenous people, we have to give the land back. You cannot decolonize as long as you're on stolen land. It's just not possible. And so the book actually offers people some thought experiments for them to do with their business if they don't have the capacity to give the land back, because a lot of businesses don't even own the land that they're sitting on. But, about shifting how you think about the Indigenous peoples around you. But you can put us on your budget line, and we're a registered nonprofit now, so I'm not above taking corporate money.
Nice.
So we do. We then turn it around and disperse it to Indigenous communities that are doing all kinds of really neat things. People can find out more about that on the website, payyourrent.ca. We've got stories that, from different people that we've supported and things that we've done. I'm really proud. I think of the two things that I've put out into the world other than my kids. I'm really proud of the book and that foundation because they're both, kind of doing similar but different things in the world. And I guess the thing that I would really want to leave people with is it all feels very big and overwhelming. It really does. I mean, I doom scroll all day because I and others as well have joked about, the quality of the doom out there is really something. So how do you not keep scrolling? Because it's some really high quality doom out there. And it can feel really overwhelming. There's just too much. There's too much for my foundation to do. There's too much for my book to tackle. There's a lot of history that I didn't put in. We make choices in terms of, do I want a 5,000 page book or do I want to finish it this year? So, we make choices about what is important to be kept in. But I cite a lot of people so that people can then follow those threads out and find out more. So pick something as you go through those tasks. One of those things will particularly resonate with you. So pick that thing, build that relationship, and then do what you can in the place where you have influence, and trust that other people are also doing what they can in the places where they have influence. And these things collectively kind of find each other. And that's how we build the world that we want. Not by forming some big transnational organization and, kind of overthrowing everything. I mean, that's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about, I build my thing. I trust you to be building your thing. And then hopefully we reach some kind of critical mass where we have real choices available to people. We have, real choices in terms of how we're going to live in this world, as opposed to just, kind of a lot of these false choices that we have.
Yeah. Wow. Patty, thank you so much. I'm going to leave us there and encourage people to follow that guidance. I'll make sure there's lots of breadcrumbs from what you've said in this conversation for people to find. And I can't encourage folks enough to really put in the time to read your book and take it in and be glad you happened to write this book by accident. So thank you very much for your time.
All right. Thanks very much for having me. I really enjoyed this talk.